Well, thanks very much, Kevin, and it is great to be here today with such a great group of people, most of whom I know at least by reputation, some personally, and others I'm sure I'll get to meet today. But it's great also to follow on from David, who's truly one of the great classicists, I think, in Australia. And David was instrumental in bringing classics to Campion. So obviously Campion's a liberal arts degree, but focusing mostly on the humanities, but taught in English, and with some science. So based on the American model of liberal arts. But we do have a classics program as well, running concurrently with our liberal arts degree, a diploma of classical languages, looking at Latin and Greek, and I think it's a crucial part of what we offer, and an increasingly rare part of what happens in higher education in Australia. We had to get our diploma accredited, and part of that process to get the classics diploma accredited was to have another institution, in a sense, sponsor us and sort of be a brother institution to our program. And we found out there was not one other diploma of classical languages being offered in Australia. There was one at Macquarie, but they were ceasing it at the end of that year. Sydney had a classics program, but weren't keen for sort of legal reasons or whatever to be a brother to us. We just had to go ahead anyway, and they gave us a pass to offer it. But it was just a sign to see how classics, even in the sandstone universities, is sort of falling away, which is a very sad thing. But we're very proud to have that program. In many ways it's due to David's work. And just another sort of positive note there, I think there are, certainly in Sydney at least, and again, these tend to be the more, well, one would say, elite schools, are still very much offering classics programs in languages. And I had the principal of PLC, Presbyterian Ladies College, call me probably about 3 weeks ago, looking for a graduate from our diploma of classics program, anyone who could teach there, because they're struggling to get teachers, but there's still popular programs in some of these schools. But I'm tasked to talk about virtue today, well, the place of virtues in a classical education curriculum. And just again, in a way of background, I was a teacher in high schools for 10 years here in Melbourne, so at Mazenod College and St Peter's out at Cranbourne, before teaching a number of years, nearly a decade at the University of Notre Dame, Australia, and now nearly 8 years at Campion College. It's only in these last 8 years that I've truly, I guess, identified, I probably felt in my heart, some of the lack that we have in our education system that's moved increasingly away from a liberal focus of education. And so now, obviously, I'm a great champion of it, and not from the inside. But really, as I was teaching and as in those two institutions, high schools and then university, I felt it, but I didn't realise it until I was at Campion and experiencing that I was really sold on the idea and saw this as a really important thing. And increasingly, as this, I think, group represents in Australia, I think there is a real movement. And to get to Tim's question, which I was really struck by, I think it's a really important one, is that I think even in the broader spectrum of education in Australia, and even in universities, there's a sense that undergraduate education is really failing our students. I mean, so many are leaving their undergrad degrees, up to around 30% are either changing or dropping out in that first year. I mean, that's a massive failure. And more and more people are saying, well, we need a broader undergrad degree before people specialise. And that's the University of Melbourne model, which they have now. But I think there's that sense, I don't think they have the answer, but I think there's a sense that that's important for Australia, for the reasons I think Tim quite rightly pointed out. So the idea of virtue. So virtue, we don't often think of virtue as really part of the curriculum, because we need to know things, in education. Education is about knowing things, getting information and knowing. So virtue is rarely spoken about in education. So in this short presentation, I want to just give a general introduction to the idea of virtue and why it's important in education. And then just give a quick sort of 5-minute lesson in the history of education, the place of virtue in education. and then just finish with some reflections on how, in education itself, in an education system, how virtue can find a place there. So virtue is excellence of character. And classically speaking, we talk about the 4 cardinal virtues of prudence, justice, temperance, and courage or fortitude. And these are classical virtues from Greece. So pre-Christian, non-Jewish understanding of excellence of character. And it was truly part of the education system of the classical world. Virtues are taught, learned, and practiced. That's how we become virtuous. First, we need to learn them. Someone teaches them. We need to live them in a certain way. So by living them and practicing them, we grow in virtue. And virtues are crucial to be taught and lived in the early years. So, in a way, and I think this is true of that old expression, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Once you reach a certain age, probably everyone in this room is past that age now, it's very hard to grow in virtue because our character has been formed. Our neural pathways are there, they're pathways, and it is hard to change. Not impossible, thankfully, but it is harder to change. And that's why, those formative years are crucial. My children have had experience in the PARED system. Some of you are very knowledgeable of that system here in this room. And that's, virtues have been an explicit part of that formation for my children, which has been great. So education is not just simply about knowing things and information. I think education is intrinsically linked to freedom, to growing in freedom. And this is where connected to the word liberal. So a liberal education is an education in freedom. However, today we live in a climate where freedom is understood in a fairly narrow sense. A true sense, but narrow. That is, I'm free to do what I want. That's what people understand by freedom. It's sort of the adolescent idea of freedom. When I turn 18, I'll be free. I have my license, I can drink, I'm free. And everyone goes through that stage. The Western world, in general, is in that adolescent stage of freedom. That freedom equals I can do what I like. No one can tell me what to do. So it's a true sense of freedom, because that's part of freedom. It's what we could call freedom from restraint. In order to be free, you need to not have those restraints. So it's hard to be free in prison in that sense, because you're restrained. However, it is a narrow version of freedom. True freedom is about freedom for. So you're free from, why? To be free for that which is true, that which is good, that which is noble. That's real freedom. And that's where the virtues come in, because we can't really be free for the truth, free for the good, free for that which is noble and beautiful, without having excellence of character to help us to be free. Again, you may be free because there's laws and people who are sort of forcing you to be free, but that's not real virtue. Real virtue is excellence of character. So education is about an ordered liberty. In many senses, that's what the great democracies in the world are founded upon, ordered liberty. So we may have a free citizenship, but if it's not connected to that which is true and good, then it can quickly form into, in a sense, what we have a lot in Western democracies today. A sort of tyranny of the majority in some respects, and where truth is not a concern. It's, getting power through votes in whichever way you can. So it really does impoverish our democracies. And I think this is very true when you look at the American founding, which is very much on this principle of ordered liberty. And that's why I think America is breaking apart at the moment, because there's no sense of what is good, what is true. It's simply about power. So, quick sort of 5-minute sort of lesson in sort of how virtue has played its role in Western idea of education. Now, the West, in general, Education has really been at the heart of Western civilization, perhaps uniquely in terms of the great civilization around the world. Education has really been at the heart. And for the Greeks, and this is, a lot of you would know this better than me in here, but for the Greeks there was an educational idea, paideia. And this was not simply an educational idea about, knowing things, but it was an idea and an ideal of education that was about the culture and about the human person as a whole. So it was not just about knowing things, but about being someone. To become a certain type of person, not just a person with knowledge. So it was an education about the person. And for the Greeks, there was an objective human nature. That the human nature that we all shared, there was an objective truth about that. And so paideia, or this educational theory, was about forming that nature, that objective nature. And how this was formed, particularly the higher faculties of the will and the intellect, were through the acquired virtues of wisdom, justice, temperance, and courage. These were the necessary virtues to become an educated person. The famous saying of the Roman Juvenal was, "A rightly reasoning mind in a well-formed body is the educated person." Thus, education for the ancients was a moral formation, not just about having a mind stuffed with information. It was a moral formation. Education was a type of conversion to a certain way of life, and that goodness and justice were at the heart of this conversion. The Greeks also had a tremendous confidence in the human mind's ability to grasp the truth, objective truth. And they were not afraid to pursue all the questions of life, even those they couldn't find answers to. They weren't afraid to ask them. What is the meaning of life? Is there some sort of life after death? So on and so forth. So for the Greeks, and then really the Romans as well, at the heart of the educational idea was moral excellence founded on the virtues. However, they were a bit like someone who was all dressed up with nowhere to go. So they had this tremendous idea of, education and formation, but no telos, no sort of end game. And that's where Jerusalem comes through, both for the Jews and for Christianity. And so the West is this great marriage between Athens and Jerusalem. The Greek paideia and Jerusalem of faith. Faith and reason. And although it was a struggle for the early Christians, this marriage was a natural marriage between the Greeks and Christianity and Judaism. It was a natural marriage. And perhaps key here were those figures of Christian antiquity who were classically educated in the paideia. So, one thinks of Jerome, a great classicist and the first translator of the Bible into Latin. One thinks of Augustine, of course, who was a great classicist. John Chrysostom, Justin Martyr, Ambrose, Leo the Great, all trained in the paideia, often before they were converted. And they saw this natural connection between Greek paideia and virtue and Christianity and Christian revelation. This marriage of Athens and Jerusalem really, I think, reaches a climax in the Middle Ages, certainly in the Catholic tradition, with the foundation of the first universities. Built on the liberal arts, the trivium and the quadrivium, leading to philosophy, which sort of brings everything together, and then the queen of the sciences, theology. So here, in these medieval universities, Oxford, Paris, Bologna particularly, we have this, the marriage in a sense becomes really real between Athens and Jerusalem. And the idea of virtue as part of education, as part of, educating the Christian, was a key to this. So, in this last little part of this paper, I want to speak about how we can think perhaps about virtue today in our sort of education system, in our curriculum, in our schools, and in our higher education. So virtue, as I said before, virtue are these excellence of character, which I think bring together a world that is quite fragmented and people that are fragmented. So the fragmentation of the world begins with ourselves. And by fragmentation, I mean that the human person is an integrated being. We're created in an integrated way, body and soul, emotions, memory, passions. We're meant to be one as a human person. But in the Christian sense, certainly in the Jewish Christian sense, through original sin, that's fragmented. That, my mind won't necessarily do, or my body won't necessarily do what my mind tells me. And that usually happens for me when the alarm goes off in the mornings. So my mind says, yes, I've got to get up. My body's saying, just a few more minutes. And that's our fragmentation. For most of Western civilization, this was a given. We are fragmented beings, but we're called to a reintegration. And society, the church, universities, education was about reintegrating the person. Really, since the Enlightenment, but more so, perhaps even more so the last sort of 50 or 60 years, that is absolutely no longer the case. That fragmentation is who we are, and in fact, it's encouraged, really, in our education system. It's encouraged, in a sense, in society. There's no longer this sense of reintegration. So the key three letters in terms of reintegration are that little three-letter conjunction, and. And I think and is the most crucial word in some ways when we're thinking about virtue and education. Because it's the word that brings together and doesn't separate. And so in the religious sense, or in a religious school, that faith and reason must be at the heart of the curriculum. Faith and reason. And I think too, and I speak here from the Catholic context, one I'm most familiar with, but too often, a Catholic school will have, your science faculty here, and your religion faculty here, and your humanities faculty there, and there's no and connecting anything. So you'll go into the science room, and a good science teacher, but having no knowledge of the Catholic educational tradition, will talk about science and never mention faith at all, never. We'll never mention the fact that science really came out of the West and came out of these medieval universities. And so many of the great scientists were religious. It's never mentioned. And no fault of the science teacher, but it's never mentioned. And you go over to the religion class and they're talking about, how science and faith are compatible, but in the science class, science and faith are incompatible. The poor student is sitting there getting completely different worldviews. So the key, that and must be really at the heart. And so it's not to say that religion is in the science classroom, but in the science classroom it should be talked about the harmony between faith and reason. And that in pursuing science, we're pursuing truth. And God is truth. So this key and, faith and reason. And I think the word or the virtue that's absolutely key in our education system is wisdom. So wisdom or prudence is the charioteer of the virtues, as the medievals called it, the charioteer, the leading virtue. So wisdom is about right judgment. Right judgment. But it's also having right judgment through bringing things together, bringing disparate things together. And wisdom is in short supply. Thomas Aquinas referred to wisdom, I don't think he used these exact words, but more or less was saying common sense. Seeing the world around them and being able to put disparate things together to make a coherent judgment. And I think, again, to go back to Tim's questions here, this is a crucial area in terms of public policy and I think we saw it very much in the pandemic. There was specialisation, but not a lot of common sense, not a lot of wisdom. And I think that's a really key virtue that needs to be taught and encouraged by bringing the different disciplines and ideas together under the overarching idea of truth. But those other virtues are perhaps a bit more difficult to speak more explicitly about in a school, because wisdom is an intellectual virtue and sort of you see its place in a school. But what about justice? How do we talk about justice in the context of an education? So, we often talk about social justice, and that certainly has its place as a part of justice. But justice as a virtue is giving what is owed to the other. And that is a virtue that absolutely is at the heart of a school. What does a teacher owe to a student? What does a student owe to a teacher? What does a student owe to their parents? And so on and so forth. Justice should be at the heart of everything that's studied in school, to grow in justice, in that virtue. Temperance is, again, a fairly obvious one, self-control. It's very hard to succeed in studies without self-control. Very, very hard to succeed in life without self-control. It's an absolutely necessary virtue to learn. And it should be talked about explicitly in school as a virtue to be learned, lived, and developed. And the last is courage, or fortitude. Again, absolutely vital to a flourishing education. For without moral fortitude, one cannot flourish, even just pursuing one's studies. The great Dominican thinker, A.G. Sertillanges, wrote a fantastic classic work on education called The Intellectual Life, around about 1920. And he spoke about this in terms of education, that education naturally incorporates the virtues. Any pursuit of knowledge should. If you're pursuing the truth, or the truth for its own sake, you'll become more virtuous if you do it well. And moral courage, so not just being moralistic, but moral courage is first and foremost courage fighting a battle against yourself when it's tough. But obviously today, increasingly, it's a moral fortitude and courage against a culture that perhaps is less inclined, particularly in a Christian setting, to accept one's ideas and beliefs. And that's really important for our young people, certainly in religious schools, to learn moral courage and to live it, even in the context of their schooling. So Walker Percy, the great novelist from the South in America, 20th century novelist and satirist, he said it's possible to get an A in everything in your studies but flunk life. It's possible to be a great economist but be a terrible person. You could be the world's best surgeon but have no idea who a human person is. Virtue in education is there to help. When someone is excellent, even on an intellectual level, they'll also be excellent on a human level, and I think it really needs to be encouraged and incorporated when it can. And on that note, I'll finish. Kevin.
Thank you very much. A very virtuous talk.
Very virtuous.
A lot there to think about. Questions again from anyone?
Yeah, I've got a question.
Yeah, Peter.
Thanks, Paul. Thank you very much. Just coming back to your point about the need for wisdom and prudence as a leading virtue. I wonder if the problem with the absence of wisdom and judgment and prudence is that actually judgment is discouraged, because judgment involves an ordering of preferences, and it means saying that something is better than something else, and that is discriminatory, and it's marginalising, and it's oppressive, and it creates unsafe spaces. And that when we, and I think this touches on things that David was talking about as well, once we lose the capacity to judge, or even the courage to judge, we're in a great deal of trouble, because then anything goes, and subjectivism reigns. That's sort of a statement and a question combined.
Yep.
I suppose my question is, why do you think it's so difficult to restore the place of wisdom, or to restore wisdom and prudence to the place that they should have?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, Peter. That more and more it is discouraged to make a judgment. So again, an experience at Campion is obviously a bit different, but when I was at Notre Dame University, where it was a lot more students and people from all different backgrounds, I was teaching the core curriculum there, and also core curriculum to the med students who came from everywhere, and that was a real issue. So whenever I would encourage a judgment about a certain, maybe an ethical question or a question about God or whatever, for a lot of these students, they'd never been able to do that, coming from their other undergraduate programs that they've done at universities, where that wasn't encouraged at all. There was one sort of line they had to take, or they had to be quiet. So it was a real struggle to actually allow that to happen, and that obviously doesn't help in the idea of making judgment, which wisdom encourages. And wisdom is, like all the virtues, is done through experience. You do it. So even if you make a mistake, that's a learning experience. So long as it's clear it's a mistake. That's why it's important to call out mistakes in young people. Say that was a wrong thing to do. And that the student feels, that is the wrong thing to do. I won't do that again. That's part of growing in wisdom. It's part of learning right from wrong. And because of this increasingly subjectivised world, that right and wrong doesn't necessarily exist. That makes it very hard. And of course it does exist, because no school could operate without it. So it does exist in practice, and it exists everywhere in practice. But no one sort of owns up to it. And it's only done in certain ways. So I think that's true, but I also think there's a lack of wisdom and common sense because of the hyper-specialisation. And that, I'm good at that, so I'll ignore everything else. So we encourage that at such a young age, say year 9 and 10, you'll be a maths science person. And they'll never ever touch a book again to learn more about humanity. And vice versa too. So I think that's really crucial, that the specialisation coming younger and younger, it means that wisdom is harder and harder to acquire.
Yeah.
Thanks, Paul. Do you think the fullness of virtue will be increasingly difficult to teach until Jerusalem is put back into, say, the home, schools, society, and beyond?
Yeah, absolutely. But having, the virtues they're classical natural virtues, so they're basically human virtues, don't require any sort of faith to understand or live them or believe them. So, coming from Aristotle. But obviously, there was a great sort of intellectual debate within the Catholic Church. So this is looking at the Catholic tradition around morality, and involves the so-called new natural lawyers. So John Finnis from Australia. I don't know if anyone's heard the great jurist from born in South Australia at Oxford University, John Finnis. Robbie George from Princeton, who studied under Finnis. You may have heard of him. He's a very sort of famous public intellectual in the States. They're new natural lawyers, and their position was that they could go in and bat for, if you like, traditional Catholic morality, Christian morality in the courts and in law and in politics without any recourse to divine revelation. We can do this. And so that was a position sort of, from the 80s through to the early 2000s. And in Australia, that was quite a strong movement as well. So the current Archbishop of Sydney, for example, studied under Finnis and is a new natural lawyer. And here at the now defunct John Paul II Institute here in Melbourne, there was a couple of the bioethicists there were part of that. This is a long-winded answer to this question. Well, sorry, I'm going down a rabbit hole of Catholic intellectual debate. But they were holding that we could debate sort of on Senate committees and so on and leave our faith at the door. But everyone knew they were Catholic. They weren't sort of afraid to say that. But they've lost every debate. So it's increasingly, and when you hear, and I remember Nick Tonti Filippini, who was one of them here in Melbourne, he's since died. He told me not long before he died, he said, I used to think that, but I don't think it anymore. If he was going to those Senate committees, he'd be more, trying to convert them during the coffee breaks, because he thought that would be the only way to change their mind. So I think that's in some ways an answer to your question, but it's, I think it still needs to be talked about because they are classical natural virtues, and we're talking about the virtues, but at the same time, it helps if one has a supernatural vision of things. And
Down the back.
Well, first of all, I want to congratulate you for every single word that you've just shared with everyone in this room.
Thanks.
You mentioned figures like Jerome, Augustine, Justin Martyr. Now, the question I have, and I'll say it slowly. Imagine the things that you have just told us with a spirit of love and understanding. Imagine these things can be said to a group of principals, whether they be Melbourne or Sydney or Perth. Do you think it's wise that slowly we give thought to the idea where we gather a group of Catholic principals and we just share what you've just shared with us to them, with the hope that they will be won over, that like we have been won over by what you said, because what you say is truth. It's part of the Catholic intellectual tradition. It's what Catholic principles are all on about. So my question to you is it possible that we consider inviting some principals, inviting, not coercing. It's an open invitation where they listen to people like yourself and then they can ponder what they just heard and say, maybe I need to start looking at these things about virtue in my students, with my teachers, with my students. I need to go back to what my original mission is as a Catholic principle.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. But I gave not the same talk, but a similar talk recently to the National Catholic Education Conference. So there was about 100 people. I'm sure there was a few principals there. So that was a good thing to do. And so I think it's the more the merrier. Absolutely.
Just on that point, if I could interrupt, sorry. Who have we got from Max here?
Yes.
I understand there is, I was talking to Jim a couple of months ago. Max is undergoing a review, as businesses do, or schools do, or universities do. So when you look at, and I've read some of the documentation, there are very clear statements about what the purpose of a Catholic education is, or what the purpose of the schools should be. Can you just explain, not share, but tell us about any of that, please?
Sure, and just some background. Paul and Joe, we're members of our group, an advisory group to the Archbishop around liberal arts education and Catholic.
So there's a group working already.
Group.
Yeah.
We've been working for maybe 2 years, a little longer.
Yeah, probably 2 years. Yeah.
Yeah, so still reviewing and building a case for some expression of liberal arts education in our Catholic schools. So, as Paul said, recently spoke at the National Conference, and in terms of our kind of mission, very much that notion of the formation of the whole child, picking up on many of the things that Paul shared, and being unapologetically Catholic in our mission of education. And so we're working on a strategy. I haven't seen, it's beyond my pay scale, I haven't seen the latest draft of that, but in the coming months that will be shared and distributed, and we will begin to implement that in our schools.
No, excellent, yeah. Thank you for that. Question? John?
Well, I've heard that virtue ethics has had a bit of a resurgence over the last 30, 40 years. I was wondering if you could say a little bit about why you think that has happened. It's such an old idea,
Yep.
but it's had this rejuvenation. And also, what do you think of the possibilities of virtue formation, virtue ethics appealing to, that resurgence has largely happened, I believe, in the Christian sort of world and maybe a little bit in the academic world, but how much appeal has it got outside of that? What are the possibilities for that movement growing, and maybe what are the limits of it?
Yeah, that's a good point, John. There has been a resurgence in philosophical ethics. Has been a resurgence in virtue ethics, and it started with Elizabeth Anscombe, the Catholic philosopher. She wrote a book, would have been in the 1930s. Her and her husband Peter Geach, both Catholic philosophers. She was most famous as being anti-nuclear war. She was an activist, but a great philosopher and a virtue ethicist, and wanted to recapture Aristotle, and was a mainstream philosopher, quite famous in England. And then it was taken up, another resurgence through Alistair MacIntyre. So he was a Marxist, became a Catholic, still alive. I think he's in his mid-90s. He's at Notre Dame in the States. One of the foremost philosophers of the last 40 or 50 years in the English-speaking world. And he's a virtue ethicist. His famous book in 1981 was called After Virtue. And he was saying that after Nietzsche and after the rise of relativism, we need to go back to virtue. And he was doing this in an academic setting, mainstream. And so if you go on sort of the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which is a great internet resource, and you look up virtue ethics, and there's tons of stuff. So it's mainstream, but unfortunately it hasn't sort of seeped down too much. Hasn't seeped down, and I think that's so I think there's a movement in universities, like an academic level. Again, it's not the one the most popular, but it's certainly there. So anyone doing philosophy today, a philosophy degree, would do some virtue ethics, at least do a nod to it. So I think that's a good thing. And again, it's come out of the sort of Catholic intellectual tradition, but it's an important renewal. And so therefore I think it is a language that is appealing to people. I mean, virtue is a sort of non-confrontational word. Most people want to be wise and just and have self-control and a bit of courage. So they're nice words. People want to be free. So they're good words to use in a more secular setting as well, I think.
Tim?
Yeah, sorry, I don't want to have too many comments, but my second one.
There's no quota.
Pick up on your comment about we have an adolescent idea of freedom in the West. I'm also riffing back to a podcast, I think it was a Patrick Coffin podcast some time ago, where he interviewed an author who talked about that your 20s is the decade you set yourself up for life. I'm interested in your perspective on this, given your cohort of students. This is partly autobiographical, I confess, but also as a parent I've got 3 in their 20s now and an 18-year-old and younger couple. I just think that's a real challenge in this moment, is to get people, kids of that age, to not waste that precious time with that sort of continued adolescence. What can you say positive about encouraging people in that age to sort of pick up on this wonderful liberal arts agenda we're talking about and sort of expand their minds and don't waste that precious time so that they set themselves up for life?
Yeah, I mean it's a big question.
I mean,
So yeah,
sorry,
but
one of the poisonous things obviously that's occurred, you talked about the last 50 years, obviously the sexual
revolution.
era of
Yeah.
sexual liberation has kind of, from a sort of, I guess, theological perspective, has really targeted that precise age group, sort of taken them away from what we're trying to encourage.
There's a
Absolutely.
swing back in America now. Quite interesting. A lot of these young Americans don't want to have sex.
Yeah.
I'm trying to work out why. But, sorry about that.
Yeah. But this like.
Sorry.
Yeah, I won't answer that question. Yeah, I think it's the perpetual adolescence is a big problem, and I mean we're all adolescents in some area of our life. So each of us, struggle in a certain area where we're not really free and we haven't grown in a virtue in some ways. But where society sort of encourages it, it makes it really hard. And I think more and more it's thought, maybe when you're 30 you probably should grow up. And it's a fair way down the track, and it's hard to learn virtue after 30. So the earlier the better to learn these things and to live them. But it's very hard once they have that sort of more unrestrained freedom. So the freedom from where when they turn 18 and leave home and so on, that's where they're at the mercy in some ways of what they've learnt before and where they're going. But as far as we can, I think that age between 18 or wherever they finally end up in terms of what they're going to do with the rest of their life is it's important that they in some ways give themselves. I think that they have something that they can actually forget themselves and doing something for someone else. That's crucial. And that's it's a more Christian idea of virtue, but it's absolutely crucial. Because if you're still self-centered when you're 30, you're still going to be self-centered when you're 70. It's not going to change. So unless that happens, and I think that gets to the point where it's, it can be a wasted 12 years where you just do whatever you like. And that can be a real problem because the rest of you, even when you're married, you just want to do whatever you like. It's going to be a hard marriage.
Can I make an
Yeah,
observation there, Paul? I've always maintained that the middle school age, from 8 to 12, is, I often say to parents, it's the golden age. That children will acquire virtues. They'll acquire good habits. You can get them to do good things repeatedly. They end up as virtues. Then when they're teenagers, they can test all of that, but innately they know what's right and they have self-dominion, that they can do the right thing.
Yeah.
So that adolescence then should be a short period, or in fact never be a crisis at all. If virtue is there when they're younger, and they're not questioning things, that depends on parents giving good example.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's all together, but I think that's so true. There's a theory about stages of freedom. So there's the stage of childhood. So that early stage of childhood is associated with discipline. So discipline is can be seen as a negative word, but it's such a crucial stage. And also it's the word disciple. So you're a disciple at that age, and you're just learning from others, and others need to teach. There needs to be masters in a young person's life, teaching. And then that next stage is that golden age where virtues can be more explicitly sort of taught and lived to the point where hopefully they will do the good thing for its own sake. They'll understand that it actually is a good thing. Not because in the discipline stage it's only good because I get a lolly for it, or I don't go in the corner, or I don't get in trouble, so I'll do it. Whereas that next stage, it should be that progression towards I'll do it because it is a good thing. And then hopefully that will lead to a virtuous life, a real freedom. We never quite get there in all areas of our life, and that freedom should be a creative freedom. So often you can think of morality and growing in virtue as sort of restricting, but it's absolutely creative. And the analogy that I've heard, which I think is a really good one, is learning an instrument. So when you might be free to learn a piano because you've got the money, you can get the lessons, there's a piano sitting there. And you can go over there and go like that. But that's not freedom in terms of the piano. It's just chaotic noise. You need a master to teach you the grammar of the piano, the rules, the language of the piano. And then it's only over time that you'll learn great pieces. And then the ultimate is you've got that real creativity. You can create music through these rules, through these virtues, if we're using the moral life, to make a really creative life. And in the Catholic lexicon, that's the freedom of the saints. Where none two are the same. They're just completely free and creative.
Just a quick one. You might remember John Howard, many years ago, when he was Prime Minister, introduced to schools the idea of values. And they spent millions of dollars doing brochures and materials, and I think one of them was Simpson and his donkey, the poster, that was attacked and vilified for all kinds of reasons that you'd know. But how do you distinguish between values and virtues? Because even still, if I go online and look at schools and look at their philosophy or how they define their purpose, it's often values, values, values. So how do you distinguish between values and virtues?
I think values as a word would be more associated with an institution, and this is what we hold dear. Maybe this is what, but it can become quite vague, and that can be a problem. Whereas virtue is personal, and it's about being a good and flourishing person. So it's a more real thing. Whereas values are a bit more opaque, and we value justice, but we may not necessarily live it. So it's
Cycle gang would have their own values.
yeah, exactly. They've got some values. Yeah. So some sort of shared interest or shared idea, and there's a place for that, but it particularly today, I think it's lost a sense of it.
True.
Yeah.
So we're ahead of schedule, or schedule. Another question, sorry.
Yeah.
Just touching on the theme of faith and reason, as someone who's involved in 3 Catholic schools, one as a teacher, two as a parent, I see and I think we all know, there's a lot of students who are disconnected from the faith. There are a lot of parents that send their children to the school, not because they support the faith, for other reasons. We also have a lot of teachers, and I know quite a lot of teachers, who don't care anything about the faith as well. There are a percentage as well that are faithful. Do you think, with relation to establishing classical schools, we should go on the way like Campion and build up specialist schools for those parents that want to send them there? Or should we continue to fight to reform our current Catholic schools, but knowing this will take years, maybe never, because of the high number of cohort that we got there? So which direction do you think?
Well, I think both, really. I think it needs both. And it's, the Catholic education system, and I guess the Christian, Christians, it's a bit different because they're more independent and their own unique sort of schools. But the Catholic education is massive, absolutely massive, and obviously, mostly publicly resourced. And we need to, it's not going to change, and we should be in there batting for the good and the true, and in there doing what we can. And it's been really encouraging in Melbourne with the, being just very, not a big part, but just in this advisory way, just seeing, there's an appetite for that, and, let's hope it, really does bear some fruit. But then, yeah, absolutely, where I think there should be, maybe sort of lighthouse places that are really places where, are independent, sort of parent-driven or whatever it is, that are more lighthouse, but maybe a bit smaller, independent, that can point to a different way as well. But in Australia, because it's so, it's a great thing. We've got such a generously publicly funded Catholic system, but it's also difficult because it's so big. So it's hard to move around. It's hard to change. And whereas, so I'm seeing lots of great things in smaller Christian schools, independent schools, new schools starting, the par ed schools, and because they're, it's easier to move because you're smaller and you just get in there and change things and do things. James?
I'm a businessman. It's a practical question, right? So it's probably one of the few things I feel like I've got any ability to speak intelligently on. Campion came from the example of small liberal arts colleges that were started in the US in the early 70s by academics who were appalled at what was happening to the mainstream and large Catholic universities, which are still to this day considered very prestigious and huge endowments. And they are now, more and more of these colleges are springing up across the US. And what that has led to is existing institutions which were failing over there, looking to reform themselves on the basis of these new institutions that have sprung up that were very small in the 70s, but now 50 or 40 years later are flourishing and becoming more and more significant and prominent. The same thing is happening in classical education in the US. A lot of new schools are opening up, and there's so many of them now that schools that are about to close, or parents are very, very frustrated with the offering, or the governors of those institutions, are now looking into these new schools as models for how they might reform themselves. Australia was miles behind, but there are the beginnings, as evidenced by all the people in this room, of those same sort of what my father used to call flowers in the desert. So, as a businessman and observing what's happened to the US and with 3 children having gone through the so-called prestigious Catholic schools of Brisbane, or where most finished there, I think the best way forward at the moment is to start again. And then over time, existing institutions will follow the lead. I don't know if that's helpful.
I'm very happy behind this.
So, thank you very much, Paul.
Pleasure.